This is the Mantapam where Bhagavan briefly lived around 1902. It's very gaily painted at the moment because there was a big Kumbhabhishekam, that's a ritual reconsecration a few days ago. In Bhagavan's day it was a more, so we say, genteelly run down temple. There was a sandy surface here, old unpainted granite pillars, except for this one over here, which was smeared in oil and worshipped on a daily basis by Kiraipati, who was one of Bhagavan's devotees. And the general consensus in Ramanashram, not disputed by Bhagavan, is that Kiraipati was the previous incarnation to Lakshmi the cow. And for many, many years she did her morning puja to this bas-relief of Ganesh on this pillar outside the Mantapam. In front of me, where these coloured kolam patterns are now painted on the cement, is the sand surface where Bhagavan wrote some of the answers which later went into Who Am I? This is a significant place in Bhagavan's life and story because it was here in 1902 that he was approached by Sivaprakasam Pillai and asked the basic fundamental question, who am I? In response to which Bhagavan wrote a series of answers either on a slate or in the sand in front of where I'm sitting, and those answers were later collected by Sivaprakasam Pillai and published as a small question and answer catechism of how to do self-inquiry and how to get enlightened. Sivaprakasam Pillai was a revenue official working for the government, and he was called to Tiruvannamalai to help in the annual settlement of the town's accounts. While he was in town, he heard that there was a silent Swami called Brahmana Swami living on the hill, and he decided to come up and check him out. He came, he was very much impressed, and so he asked him the burning question which was in his mind at the time, who am I? Nanya in Tamil. Now this was the first time that anyone had approached Bhagavan and asked him the question that probably interested Bhagavan the most, and this solicited a very good response from Bhagavan. He decided to give written answers to this inquiring would-be disciple, and his first answer to this question, who am I, was Arive Nan in Tamil, which means knowledge or consciousness is I. So this is a very fundamental teaching statement by Bhagavan about the nature of the self and about the nature of all people who come to him to inquire how that self can be attained. The dialogue progressed from there. It included various points on the nature of the world, how it manifested, the nature of happiness, things like that. But the central core for me of this very small exchange was, what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of the self, and how can it be attained? After Sivaprakasam Pillai came here and asked the questions that Bhagavan wrote the answers to, Sivaprakasam Pillai went away and did nothing with the questions for about 20 years. In the early 1920s, he wrote a short Tamil verse biography of Bhagavan entitled Sri Ramana Charita Ahval. It was a long, continuous verse summary of all the details that he knew at that time of Bhagavan's life. At the end of this work, he included, as an appendix, the 13 questions and answers that he'd saved from his original meeting with Bhagavan in 1902. When this book came out, the other devotees were delighted that there was such a succinct and accurate summary of Bhagavan's teachings, particularly on inquiry, that they brought it out as a separate booklet. Now, Sivaprakasam Pillai had more material which he didn't include in this appendix, so bit by bit the original question and answer version got longer and longer. I think the original was 13. Various other versions have come out with as many as 30 questions. But the most reliable version is one that Bhagavan himself wrote in 1926. He took the existing published material that Sivaprakasam Pillai had included in his book, and he rewrote the whole teaching dialogue in the form of a Tamil prose essay, gave it the title Nanya, Who Am I in Tamil, and let Ramanashram publish it as the basic text on his teachings and how to do inquiry. It has remained to this day the most concentrated, the most fundamental exposition of Bhagavan's basic teachings, not only on self-inquiry, but the nature of the self, the nature of happiness, the nature of the world, how it manifests, and so on. During Bhagavan's stay at Ramanashram, he encouraged his brother Chinnaswami to bring out the book in a subsidized form so that anyone could read it very cheaply. He encouraged devotees to translate it and have the ashram bookstore sell it in many different languages. And sometimes if people asked him what his teachings were, he would ask them to read this little booklet first and then come back and ask if they had any supplementary questions. So it represents probably the core teachings of Ramana Maharshi condensed into one small 10-page booklet. And for that we should all be extremely grateful to Siva Prakasam Pillai. Now after Siva Prakasam Pillai left Bhagavan in 1902, he continued with his job. I think he was married at the time, and he came on regular annual, sometimes biannual visits and stayed for a few days each time. Somewhere around 1910 he resigned. I think at this point he'd become a widower, and although he seemed to have retired or resigned, he didn't commit himself full-time to being with Bhagavan. He had an idea that he should get remarried and start family life again. So he had a particular girl he was very attached to, and he went to a Ganesh temple and gave a series of questions which he wanted the deity to answer one way or the other overnight. He gave the god an ultimatum and said, here are my four questions. How do I end suffering? There's a particular girl I want to marry. Should I marry her? Yes or no? And if so, how am I going to support her? And then he more or less promised himself that if he didn't get an answer from the deity in one form or another, he would take the whole problem to Ramana Maharshi and present the same conundrum to him. So he spent the night in this temple, didn't get any message one way or the other. So he came along to Bhagavan, who at that time would have been staying in Virupaksha cave, and presented the same little mini questionnaire. Bhagavan said nothing, but Siva Prakasam Pillai said that as I sat there with Bhagavan being silent, I could actually hear an answer coming to me from Bhagavan, which said, don't have any desires, don't let your expanding mind take over, contract it, take it back, practice self-inquiry, use self-inquiry to take the mind back into the self and abide there. This is the path that is recommended for everyone. So in that silent telepathic transmission, Bhagavan gave him his answer that the correct path wasn't to be married or not be married. The correct path was to curtail desires, to do self-inquiry, to abide in the self, and to remain there for as long as possible. Siva Prakasam Pillai took this advice, and for the next several decades he was an assiduous practicer of Bhagavan's teachings on self-inquiry. He continued to be a regular visitor to Ramanashram, but he never settled there. At some point he started composing devotional Tamil poetry in which he incorporated various teachings that Bhagavan had given him, plus praise and gratitude towards Bhagavan, his guru. Now what I like about Siva Prakasam Pillai and his poetry in particular is that he doesn't varnish his relationship with Bhagavan. He admits he's not a very good devotee. He complains about his desires, he complains about not being able to do his practice properly. He compares himself to a dog and said on several occasions, I've been trying and trying and trying, but I'm not succeeding, what's wrong with me? Most people, when they write about their relationship with their guru, they give a very edited, polished version. They emphasize the good experiences, and they somehow omit to mention all the times they failed to follow the guru's teachings. Siva Prakasam Pillai was exactly the opposite. He put his shortcomings out front and was not ashamed of the fact that he'd been a devotee for several decades and still hadn't managed to do self-inquiry properly. Now these poems were much loved by the devotees at Ramanashram, so much so that Bhagavan included them in daily chanting which took place in his presence every day. Originally at Skandashram there was a daily chanting of Aksharamanamala which took about 45 minutes. When Bhagavan came down the hill, the daily Tamil chanting session was slowly expanded to include several classic devotional texts. For example, all of the Tevaram verses by Jnana Sambandha and Appar which relate to Arunachala were included. There were also verses by Tayamanavar, and Siva Prakasam Pillai's verses made this very select, club of Tamil saints whose works were chanted in Bhagavan's presence every day. That in itself is a very high recommendation of just how well regarded Siva Prakasam Pillai was within the community. When someone mentioned to Bhagavan once, Siva Prakasam Pillai has been a devotee for several decades. He doesn't seem to have got very far with his practice. That's not very encouraging for us. In his poems, he's always complaining about what a bad devotee he is. And then Bhagavan laughed and said, that's his way of praising me. When Adi Shankaracharya wrote devotional hymns, he also took the same theme and complained that he wasn't a good devotee, but no one ever says that Adi Shankaracharya wasn't in a very high state. The proof, if you like, that Bhagavan was saying that he's doing this simply to praise me came when he finally passed away in the late 1940s. Siva Prakasam means light of Shiva, and when news was brought to Bhagavan that one of his oldest devotees had passed away, Bhagavan said, Siva Prakasamana, which means Siva Prakasam has become the light of Shiva, which I think is a very high endorsement of what state Bhagavan thought one of his oldest devotees had attained at the moment he passed away.